I want to hear your answers too.
Actually, that's not quite right. So anyway, fire questions at us. Maybe we'll go through quickly and introduce ourselves and a little bit about what we're doing in aquaculture. Of course, you know, I'm Hunter Lenihan, and I've just started a center here to try to capture the energy that's growing around UCSB and the UC system in aquaculture. It's called the Sustainable Aquaculture Research Center. The focus of that is to delve into generating solutions to the big questions that have been addressed in this class, to do synthesis work about some of those big questions, such as life cycle assessment and some of the larger scale analyses of the new ways they're making feeds, to provide a clearinghouse of information and actual field-based studies of the impacts of different kinds of aquaculture and their ecosystem impacts. And so that is a sort of a broad-based program. We're trying to attract people and students and folks that are interested in working on the pressing questions of aquaculture to come forth and join us within this center and get to know it. So we're going to have more and more classes, more and more seminars and things throughout the next years that expand our insight into aquaculture. Background in aquaculture is not so much producing it, but in many states in the US and other places, they use aquaculture to produce young animals, juveniles of fish, of shellfish in hatcheries, and then they outplant those into the environment to restock overfished or hard-hit fisheries. And they do that in many different places in many ways. And there isn't a lot of science that often goes into whether that's an effective way to enhance populations and the economics associated with those kinds of efforts. So people are interested in projects that are going on in the US that are aquaculture based. That's a one that people don't often think about, is the link between producing animals that then are released into wild populations, and what is the overall ecological and economic impacts of that.
Steve Gaines, and go to a lot of meetings. On the aquaculture side of things, we've got several projects going on in the Sustainable Fisheries Group. One class that's looking at the kind of spatial planning for implementation of new aquaculture and how you do that in a strategic and sustainable way up front in terms of thinking about a new emerging use in places where there's already a lot of crowded activities and things along those lines. So that's kind of taking advantage of some trade-off analyses in terms of looking at optimal ways of implementing new uses and how you might grow this in a way that reduces conflicts and so on and so forth. We've also got a lot of projects that are looking at some of these impact questions, but putting it in the broader context of a level playing field analysis with other forms of food production, because as was discussed a little bit in the talk today, of course, every form of food production produces impacts along all of these different dimensions. And in many cases, aquaculture, despite the fact that there are a lot of opportunities for reducing some of its impacts, even at average levels today, is dramatically better than forms of particularly meat production on land, and often order of magnitude or two in for a whole variety of different kinds of environmental metrics. So we've been doing pulling together life cycle assessments across a variety of different kinds of impacts and looking at that in the context of what do choices mean in terms of shifting consumption away from the sea and into land, both in terms of agricultural and meat products, in terms of a lot of these kinds of impacts.
Hi, I'm Ben Halpern, and just in the last year or two, I've gotten pulled far deeper into aquaculture than I thought I would be, and pretty excited about it. So 3 different projects really briefly. One is in collaboration with some folks in Chile, looking at mussel and shellfish aquaculture, in particular off the island of Chiloé, where mussel aquaculture just started 15 years ago and is now the 3rd largest producer in the world. And there's some really interesting social, ecological issues in terms of how the small farms are consolidating horizontally or vertically and how that affects production. And social cultural values, and that's just ramping up and has quite a long trajectory to it in terms of potentially 6 or 8 years of work down there. The second is a SNAP, Science for Nature and People working group that I co-lead that's just starting this month, looking at aquaculture, offshore aquaculture, and Roz is a part of that, which is great. And trying to do a number of things like at best practices for offshore aquaculture, but also trying to get at global production estimates that are realistic in terms of all the other multiple uses that you need for the ocean and how much space could you actually allocate towards offshore aquaculture and different species, and what does that mean for food production and food security for different countries around the world. And the third project is in collaboration with some folks from the Harvard Public Health School, looking at ecosystem health to human health and thinking about wild-caught fisheries and aquaculture fisheries as they feed into human health concerns, not just from protein and omega-3, which is what most people pay attention to, but from all the micronutrients. And there's quite a lot of evidence that fish reduces human disease load and extends life by years in terms of these micronutrients, B vitamins and other things, and understanding how our policies for managing fisheries and managing aquaculture then translate downstream into human health is really interesting. So there's a succinct working group and some EU funding that's all feeding into trying to tackle this.
John O. Wilson with the Nature Conservancy, and I'm based here at the Bren School. And the Nature Conservancy has historically been a land conservation organization, and very recently we've been getting into scoping what we call the blue economy. And the blue economy can be interpreted as all of the different types of growth in terms of tourism in the ocean, in terms of energy, in terms of fisheries, including aquaculture. So we've become really interested in understanding how to move forward in the blue economy with sustainable design principles at play. And so that's how we are approaching this issue in terms of aquaculture and the growing need for increased protein across the globe. And so we're working with folks through the SNAP group, for instance, that Ben described, to try to understand best practices. And what we can bring to the table is this idea that the Nature Conservancy is one of the largest conservation organizations in the globe, and we have representatives in 50 some odd countries in all states. And so what we hope to do is try to understand some of these principles and take them into the field and actually implement them. And we're hoping that by 2020 we have 3 different countries that we're working with where we're trying to develop and scale up these types of design principles for sustainable aquaculture. And then more specifically, what I do in terms of aquaculture is I'm partnering with Hunter as well as other folks, including Steve. And a particular project that I'm focused on is taking place in Palau, where fishermen have historically relied on wild capture fisheries for their livelihoods. And what's happened is that the typical story, fish have gotten smaller and harder to find, and so fishermen have been fishing harder and harder, and it had an impact on the ecosystem, right, and coral reefs and the fish populations themselves. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to develop alternative livelihoods, and one of those livelihoods that we're trying to develop is the growth aquaculture of giant clams, which was historically a wild capture species. And so we're currently trying to scope this project and fundraise for it. And the idea is that we can work with the Palau government to develop a central location where you raise larvae and then outplant these at field sites in remote communities throughout the islands of Palau. And those folks with a centralized processor that can then export these giant clams for the aquarium trade as well as for food, that we think we can offset some of the pressure on those wild capture fisheries.
Okay, so what we'll do now is just kind of pass this mic around, and if you guys have questions, you can just direct them at any one of the panelists. And I don't know, who wants to start here?
I have a very general question for, I guess, everybody. What do you all see as the major hurdles for getting the U.S. scaled up in the aquaculture production scene?
I'll say just getting the regulatory environment straightened out so that people know the expectations of, I mean, right now they have to go through many different agencies that sometimes are not necessarily even saying the same thing. And so I think having a centralized agency and a more clear-cut regulatory approach, and then you could make the regulations to be what really matters for the environment and stuff. But right now, it's just got all the. I think it's the confusion there, personally.
May I ask a follow-up, though? Yeah, there's a lot of perception that it's market demand, that it's not there for aquaculture. And I don't necessarily believe that, because you see more and more products and they're being bought at increasing rates. So do you think the demand is there if it does scale up?
I think so. I mean, we're, the biggest importer of tilapia from China, and, I think people don't really know what they're eating most of the time. And even with certification stuff, I think you guys have talked about certification a little bit in this. It's confusing. I mean, when you go out and order fish in a restaurant, actually, half the time, you're not going to get what you think you're getting. And so I don't think it's necessarily on that side. I mean, I think that the California foodie population is thinking, am I eating a farm fish or a wild fish? Sometimes I go out and I'll ask the waiter, is this farmed or wild? And they'll look at me like, okay, which does she want it to be? Does she want, is she trying to not overfish, and so she wants it in a farm? She doesn't like farm. So it's, I think the demand would be there, and it's coming through, say, processed, McDonald's and processed fish stuff. You're seeing a lot of it coming through those sources as well. But I mean, all your fresh salmon, you're getting fresh salmon all year long. There's a lot of demand for that, right? And a lot of the shrimp, some of that's wild and a lot of that's farm too. We have a very healthy appetite for all that stuff.
Hi, thanks, Raz.
Good to see you again.
Yeah, you too.
He was in World Food Economy at one point.
I still have nightmares about my World Economy final, so not jealous of your students.
You did great in the class, as I recall.
I have a question actually that came up after, Jono, you introduced yourself, about sort of, we think a lot about wild fisheries here, and now we're starting to think a lot more about aquaculture. And it was interesting, in your first slide, you talked about how in 2011, aquaculture passed wild fisheries, as at least in this country. And so I guess I have a general question about what your guys' opinion are on the sort of relationships between wild fisheries and aquaculture, and are they really sort of like, are they substitutes? Are they competing markets? And then, but maybe in the small scale case, they are things that can reduce pressure on wild fisheries, but I can also imagine that increased aquaculture can lead to more demand for fish in general, which puts more pressure on wild fisheries. And so what do you think are the major trade-offs between the two big ways we get fish, and then do you think that'll change in the future?
I'll let these guys say it, but it's yeah. They are not regulated by the same group either, so that's a...
Yeah, I think this is it's a huge issue in terms of the nature of interactions between wild-caught fisheries and aquaculture. I mean, to some extent, we've talked about the feed issue. That's a clear one. But there are all kinds of market interactions that go on between these two in terms of how they affect prices, how that affects behavior. I mean, Jono talked about efforts to utilize aquaculture to reduce pressure on wild fish stocks. I think in a lot of situations, you get the exact opposite that happens, that if in fact you have growth in aquaculture of a species that is competing in the same market with wild-caught fisheries, and you drive down the wild-caught fish price, if in fact it's not really, depending upon the nature of the institution that's regulating the wild-caught fishery, you now create a greater incentive for those fishermen to fish even harder, because it's not that they're catching fewer fish necessarily, but their revenues have dropped. And so I think this is an area that requires a lot more work in terms of thinking about it, because the way you structure the regulation of the wild-caught fishery, if it's a turf system, that you can then have some of the capacity of the owners of that turf now move into aquaculture to complement wild-caught fisheries, you get a very different interaction than if the wild-caught fishery is open access. So I think this is an area of huge need for additional work, particularly because of the fact that aquaculture is going to continue to grow, and the complexities of the interactions, if we don't think about how they're going to transfer through institutions, we're going to create a lot of problems instead of solving problems.
agree with Steve. I think that how you structure those policies are going to be extremely important. You got to ensure that you don't increase that pressure on other fisheries as whether it's through economic or whether it's through policy incentives. So one of the things that we're doing, at least in this Palau case, is we are trying to implement moratorium on wild capture fisheries while we do this growth in aquaculture. But that's only a 3-year moratorium. So one of the things that we're contemplating is, well, what happens after that? Now we're going to have this aquaculture, but then those folks are going to go back to fishing. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to implement pretty important regulations that will restrict, whether it's through a turf-based system or restricted access or size limits or whatever the management intervention might be. I think my point is just it's important to think about all of those concerns before moving in blindly into one of these types of projects.
It's also just not local. I mean, if you look at the so, for example, the Chilean system in terms of turfs that was been so successful for the shellfish loco, that was really successful in terms of recovering that fishery, had really dramatic effects. But then, soon after those recoveries started to happen, there was a real development of abalone aquaculture in Asia, where a lot of the demand for loco was because it was basically being sold as an abalone. So there was a case where it's not necessarily just local interactions. These kinds of interactions are going to happen at a global level, and thinking about these market interactions between the two forms is really important. You know, that being said, this is all going to be happening at a time where the growth in demand for animal protein is exploding. So we also have to think about how this intersects with the demand side of this and where that occurs. And a lot of the growth in number of people is going to be in Africa, whereas a lot of the growth in wealth is projected in Asia in terms of how it's going to affect demand for animal protein. So there's going to be a real geography to this in terms of how it plays out. So there's a lot of problems. You have plenty of things to solve for your thesis.
There seems a real strong spatial component to it as well. Yeah. You start aquaculture in Palau for giant clam. It may reduce actually the harvesting of these major reefs of giant clam that are in other places and able to set those up as moratoriums or closed space because you have an alternative. And then you might reduce the carbon footprint. So I think there's a lot of scope for research in terms of the flows of materials from different space to different.
I agree with you, except for the ownership of and who benefits from each of those is going to be different, you know, and so it really, then you got a little bit of a conflict there, you know, and so who has the stronger political voice? Probably going to be the guy that owns the big clam bed, but it's still, yeah, that's a really interesting point.
Hi. In most cases, it seems like aquaculture is a big shift in livelihood strategy with subsequent changes in community. And I'm wondering what you guys think the biggest challenge is for that livelihood shift.
Were you a fisherman before and now you're an abalone? Yeah, and that's a great, the abalone is a great business to be in. Well, I mean, I think we should go, because this is really, you know, I'm dealing with this question in China. I was telling these guys at lunch, I'm so challenged by it because they have so severely overfished their fisheries, and you know what they really need to do is rationalize, get people out of that industry, you know. And now China can just tell them to get out, and in a heavy-handed way, and that's not necessarily great for human rights or whatever. And just have them go into a manufacturing plant or do something else, right? But most fishermen like to be out on the water and fish. You know, I mean, there is a certain reason why people love to fish and be part of that, and they don't necessarily want to work in a you know, more the small clam things might feel like, you know, more hands-on, but these can be big processing kind of facilities and more industrial and so forth. And so I think that's one thing that's, you know.
The skill sets are different. So I think there are a lot of challenges. I don't think this isn't just simply because it's the same commodity that you can just get people to, you know, be successful in aquaculture. I mean, there's the capital
Yeah.
investment side of this thing, which is non-trivial. I mean, very different than going out in your little skiff to go fishing. So, I mean, there are a lot of aspects on the social side in terms of this transition that are.
And the risk, yeah. So from the abalone producer.
I will actually comment on it. I think one of the, I wouldn't say failings, but I think that the development of aquaculture over the years, one of the sort of potentials that haven't been realized fully have been the ability to transfer people and foster the livelihood of working waterfront and get people to move laterally from fishing type economies into aquaculture economies. At least in the Western world, I kind of place that at the feet of the sort of polarization of our approach towards whether aquaculture is something that is good or bad, and whether it's approachable by someone who has limited capex to place into an endeavor, or someone who's relatively a small market entrepreneur or innovator. It just becomes impossible for them to get into it. I'll use this as a segue to plug the program that I'm trying to launch and that some of the people in the room are aware of. We're trying to develop a very community-based offshore shellfish initiative here in Southern California, and the economics are a big driver of it. And one of the things that we're trying to do is make the working waterfront, the community itself, the lead stakeholder in that exercise. And what I think that would do is by doing an umbrella permitting process and getting that out of the way, we can then therefore invite people to come in and participate through a pre-vetted set of management practices and actually promote working waterfront and try to remove some of the polarization out of the thing and really make it a community first exercise, but still accomplish the economy of scale, because aquaculture and marine aquaculture in particular has such high proportions of fixed costs and such high capitalization rates that if you don't do some sort of pre-staging, you'll never get horizontal movement and horizontal participation and development and ongoing nurturing of working waterfront.
Another point to make, I think, is, as you saw on Roz's slide, it's not like aquaculture is replacing wild-caught fisheries. They're still going along. So it's growth of the industry across those two sectors that you don't have to have wild-caught fishermen shifting over to aquaculture. They can, as long as we manage those fisheries sustainably, we're probably going to be fishing wild-caught fishes stocks for a long time, and they can keep doing that, and there'll be other people who want to get into aquaculture who will do aquaculture. So I don't think it's I mean, if they want to shift to aquaculture, fine, but we don't have to necessarily create the mechanism for that and still have both be viable.
That was fascinating. The underlying message you gave too is to keep a diversification of aquaculture and the products rather than to move towards monocropping. And there seems to be a lot of potential benefit in the ecosystem, to people's choices, to the inclusion of people within communities that may want to do different things. So that's something to really focus in on, the diversity issue across the board.
I mean, I'm sort of a fan of this in all food systems, because I think our crop-based food system, especially with climate change and other things, is going to need to have more diversity, and especially for the nutrients, micronutrients and everything that people really do need. It goes beyond just these macronutrients. And so like abalone is a great species, you know, that is just such a good one, you know, and if everything is salmon, shrimp, you know, these are the lightning rods for the depolarization, you know, a couple of these species, and there's so much more to aquaculture than that, you know, and so, but I agree, from a social perspective and an economics, so that you don't get the drop-in price that then the aquaculture producers can't afford to live, and you get more fishing around those volume, you know. So I think that it's really important on economic as well as social and biophysical.
All right. Thank you guys for a great speaker series. So there might not really be an answer, but kind of we've heard so much about the different trade-offs between meeting intensification and kind of the downfalls with that, and like the industrial farming system in the States currently. So as we're kind of in a place in the United States or maybe just in California, what should the future of aquaculture look like? Or like, where do we start? I mean, do we go first towards like smaller scale kind of local operations, or do we dive right in for that more intensive process, or what's going to be the best future there?
Well, intensive can be small scale too. You know, it's just extensive is what's using big amounts of land. You're talking about the economies to scale on some of the ocean things, but extensive on a brackish water or fresh water can also just use, you know, getting such low yields, then you're going to need more land and more water and everything else. I mean, you know, we visited a sturgeon farm that I'm not sure it's still on operation here in California, but it was really intensive. You know, I mean, it had high inputs and very high value and so forth. Didn't have a big ecological footprint, you know, but it would categorize as intensive for sure. You know, so I think of it as high input, high output more than big industrial, you know, whatever.
It would seem too that the example that you gave, Doug, of a community-based approach to first getting permits and being allowed to do it, and then capturing people's interest in an area for what they would want to produce and how could they sell it locally, seems to be a really intelligent way to move forward in California, and it is the way California is moving forward in terms of an example locally. It's constrained by permitting, at least offshore, what you can get done and who's going to regulate it. This is an example that's emerging, I think, in different places for providing the access to develop aquaculture and then having people who have incentive to come and play in that field.
Hello, everybody. The diversification of the species sounds very interesting. I was wondering if there is any economical incentive to produce any different species, because I'm thinking if there's actually a way to produce healthy, cheap protein source for those populations that are still in that protein source. I'm thinking in this kind of recent development of aquaculture in Latin America, for example, where not all the people eat fish, but if we are thinking of creating this new kind of accessible source, it is going to stay on the place where it is farmed, or is actually follow that global trend that we keep seeing. So I guess it's more than one question.
Any of you guys want?
So so I guess the question is, like, how do we produce this cheap, healthy food that could stay in the place where you're producing it instead of following these routes? Because I'm seeing salmon in Chile and shrimp. That's food that maybe not everybody can purchase.
Yeah. Which country are you from?
From Brazil and Mexico.
Okay. Well, Brazil is an interesting case. And Bangladesh is another really interesting case, you know, where the needs for protein are still pretty high, Bangladesh in particular, you know. But there's a lot of integrated systems where they're actually growing a lot of fish in their rice paddies and so forth, and all of that's being eaten locally. It's not all for a commodity system that would be for export or for movement to the cities or something like that. Eventually, you know, so there's so many examples that are meeting what you're talking about, and that's where China really developed. All these ponds were backyard ponds. I mean, these are not big facilities. These are small ponds that were in addition to having the pig and, you know, a little rice paddy and stuff like that, and the nutrition that went in, even the feeds, sometimes are the feces out of the animal, you know, whether you like it or, you know, that's all an integrated system that is working really well for local consumption. So there's a lot of really interesting and good models. So the World Fish Center is a center that just focuses, you know, kind of mainly on this as opposed to just the commodification approach of just getting one species out there globally. although they do seem to put a lot of Nile tilapia all over the world, so it's not like perfect. But you know, that's what they worry about, is the livelihoods and the ability of communities to grow what they need within a supply chain that they can work with, you know. So it's, yeah, and Brazil's really picked up on the aquaculture front, as you know. And some of that's happening in the north, you know, where actually people need more incomes and proteins.
So I have a question. I'm a little bit surprised that agriculture grew so fast in the last decade, since fish is not a new thing. So there must have been either something shifted in demand, or there have been barriers to adoption of aquaculture. My question is, like, what are the barriers to adoption of aquaculture, especially in low-income countries? Is it risk, what you mentioned, like people in Tanzania, maybe they don't know about the outcomes, or maybe it's very risky because of pathogens? Is it because there's high fixed costs involved, what came from somewhere down there, or is it like knowledge? Why is it like so slow that people in developing countries adopt aquaculture if it's so like profitable? Or
It hadn't been slow in Asia. It's been really fast in Asia. Africa is really slow because, you know, because they don't have the supply chains and the water and the systems set up generally for this kind of stuff. And I think in parts of Latin America it's been quite rapid as well. So I don't think it's been slow in the developing countries necessarily. I think that's where the big growth has been, actually.
So sorry, my question was maybe wrong. The question is, why wasn't it there 30 years ago? Right?
Oh, 30.
Yeah,
Yeah.
fish was there 30
Yeah.
years ago. The species were there 30 years ago. So why not aquaculture?
Yeah.
I think all the things you raised are key challenges that have been people have figured out ways how to solve some of those kinds of things. I think the other one is the oceans don't have property rights in most places. So this is a non-trivial thing on the regulatory side, is how you actually allocate rights to start producing aquaculture in the ocean under most situations. It's a very different situation in terms of being able to buy or lease land in a lot of settings. And so figuring out how you're going to allocate ocean access rights is, so we still don't have anything close to a good system in the U.S. I mean, half of the reason we have to go through 15 different agencies is because we don't really have any mechanism of allocating spatial rights in any form in most places in the sea. So that's been a big problem in a lot of areas.
I think also the inducement of just, we are really hitting the limit on our wild fisheries, and so many of the fisheries are fully to overfished at this point. So the incentive, and if people are going to look forward and saying, where do I want to put my money or my effort, it's in this sector where you're topped out. You know, you're not going to get more fish out of the ocean. And you know, we can catch abalone off the coast, but you're probably looking and saying, we're not going to be able to just go out and collect abalone forever off our coast either. I mean, they were pretty much over harvested as well, right? So I'm curious. Okay, so that that went out. I hate to say, I think in the 90s I went and picked up an abalone. Was it illegal then when I first moved to California? Okay. It might have been the 80s.
So I actually have a question, and it kind of touches on a little bit what you started to bring up in your presentation, Roz, and it might open a little bit of a can of worms for some folks, but in the question of genetically modified production and where it fits in aquaculture, what are some of your kind of opinions? And I think that you started to allude to, you know, in some cases there's tremendous benefits, and there's also huge environmental risks or costs associated with that. So kind of what are your insights, and then maybe other people on the panel have insights about just kind of I guess the relative cost and benefits associated with incorporating those into these aquaculture systems.
Yeah, well, the relative benefit is that you're going to get much more fish mass out of a short amount of time and so forth. The negatives are you're going to obviously need a lot more feed, you know, to feed really rapidly. You know, so all of the inputs are going to have to sort of be there too. But I see the big risk is that these animals are swimming around. I mean, right now it's being regulated for these fish to be grown in tanks and stuff that they wouldn't be swimming in the wild, and to have a sterilization gene, you know, so that they couldn't actually breed in the wild and have the biosafety issues. And those are mostly effective, but Steve, I mean, all of you guys as biologists, those aren't 100% effective when you have those. So I think that my biggest concern is probably a biosafety issue in terms of its impact on wild species and stuff. But I would love to know what you think of the that sterilization gene. And
I mean, my general reaction on these kinds of things is when you mess around with the genes in a fish like this, their likelihood of being really successful if they escape is pretty small.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think that there are some. There's nothing different about this than the massive genetic modification we've done for centuries in virtually everything we eat from land. Every crop we grow has been modified, not necessarily with the same level of sophistication you can do with genetic tools, but we've greatly modified the genotypes of those individuals, and those kinds of things can escape. And there are certainly examples of things that have, become invasive outside of agricultural and ranching systems, but the vast majority of them are not. They're, if you don't provide the kinds of things it takes that makes them successful in an intensified situation, they can't compete in the wild. So I'm less concerned about that, although I think, taking precautions on the sterilization side, those things seem totally prudent to make sense. But I guess I'm less of a concern that we're going to create some kind of new beast that's going to now be wildly successful in wild-caught stocks. I mean, in wild settings and stuff. So I'm less worried about that.
Yeah, the salmon industry as a whole, the salmon aquaculture industry is not very supportive of aqua bounty. I mean, because they know consumers have a turnoff on GMOs, and so they don't want actually some salmon coming out being GMO, where people might say, I'm just not going to eat salmon because I don't really know if it's GMO or not. So most of the pushback is actually with a lot of the pushbacks from within the salmon industry itself that actually don't really necessarily want that in their label somehow. There's probably no, I mean, they have done the studies. I don't think there's any health concerns here for the individual. But the same is actually for crops. I mean, if you look at GMO crops, there's almost zero evidence that this is going to cause a consumer health risk. But everybody thinks that that's what the big risk is. And so anyway, the perception still is important for the marketing side of it.
There are some spectacular failures, though. They have a disease problem for oysters in many of the southern eastern states. And so they introduced what they called triploid oysters, which were non-reproducing ones, they brought them down from the north into the North Carolina area with the idea of starting aquaculture of something that wouldn't then reduce the genetic makeup of the native oysters. The ones they introduced weren't reef builders. The native oysters create reefs that are very important for the estuaries. So they introduced the triploids in, and they found within a generation they had mutated back to being reproductive. And so they introduced something that would mix in with the populations and were less able to create the reefs that are the habitat that's really important. So I think there is still a lot of worry and a lot of examples where we're not good at doing that and creating a benign introduction.
You just touched on some public perception issues, specifically the GMO salmon, which I think has gotten a lot of press that people don't want that. At least there's a loud voice that don't want that. But what other type of public perception research do you know of on aquaculture in general?
Well, so the different groups from, I think Pew has done survey, different groups have not the Ocean Conservancy, but I'll think of the group in a minute, have done different polls on certainly certification and what should be in certification and what should not, should farm versus wild, do people care about these different issues and so forth. And the fact is consumers are so confused about this, I mean, so there's not like one, it's not like and most of these that I know of are in the United States and not outside, although Europe's probably done some of this too. It's not that consumers generally think farmed is worse. You know, a lot of them think farmed is better because oceans are so overfished, you know. So they've got legitimate sort of things coming in on both sides. The certifications, well, you guys had, I guess, a talk on certifications. The certifications have tried to get at least a clear reading on the aspects of the aquaculture industry that are more harmful to the environment, just like the aspects of the fishing, wild fishing industry that are more harmful to the environment. So I know Monterey Bay Aquarium spends a lot of time doing that, and they reach out to people that are interested enough to know what they're eating. You know, to know that they are happy to eat farmed as long as they know it's sort of sustainable, that doesn't have these major sort of problems with impacts on wild fisheries or coastal habitat or pathogen transmission, things like that, you know. So I guess the research that I know is that it's been, there's not a clear farm versus wild thing that's come up, but that consumers want food safety, you know, sort of the healthy product and the environmentally sound product, whichever it is, I guess has been what I've known.
My take on it is in line with what Steve's doing his work on, is that I don't think aquaculture has been put up against other food systems enough in marketing and people's sort of understanding of impacts, because there's lots to improve on with aquaculture, but in the big picture, it's a far, far better way of getting protein in food sources. And so my guess is that few people know that, and if they did, it would really change, well, I don't know, who knows if it would change their behavior, but at least it would potentially change their behavior a lot in how they're viewing and aquaculture and products and consuming them.
I was at a conference where there were a bunch of people from the Seafood Watch group.
Oh, there. Seafood Watch, that's what I was trying to
Yeah, and it was a really interesting discussion because, I mean, I think I have seen lots of people in restaurants where they're trying to figure out, okay, which of these fish things do I buy? And I can't find any of these on my seafood card. So, okay, if I can't tell, then I'm not going to be sure it's sustainable, so I'm going to order the beef or something like that. And I'm going, whoa. And I think there's a big problem with that, is that we've kind of elevated in some ways an appropriate discussion about how do you reduce impacts of different forms of ocean-based food production. But if it's not put in the context of, well, what are your alternatives, even from some of the worst options in the ocean when you pick things on land, that we often make, you know, irrational choices. And so I think this is a non-trivial problem to deal with. And it is interesting that aquaculture, I think, the problems with aquaculture have resonated, at least in the US and in the EU, where I've been, much more with the general public than the same problems associated with food production of every other form that doesn't come from the sea, which are often much worse. You know, and so it's an interesting challenge.
Hi there. I was just wondering, is there anything known about the footprints of aquaculture in other people's waters? So, like, how many companies are owned by the U.S. that aren't in U.S. waters, or by China that aren't in Chinese waters? Is there any kind of tracking known? Somebody mentioned going to a different nation's waters who have fewer regulations. Probably not. Curious.
Yeah, I was wondering, building on what you were talking, if you know if there is a difference on the perception and acceptance of aquaculture in countries where they are importing or exporting. If they are producing aquaculture, I'm from Chile, and I feel that there has been such a huge campaign against aquaculture in Chile initially, not that much now. So I was wondering if that's equal across countries, or that kind of denial against aquaculture is within the countries that are producing the most.
Yeah, salmon of all the species I've worked with is sort of the lightning rod, you know, and I think it's because so polarized. So Doug, is that talked about the polarization. This field really is polarized, but I found it much more polarized salmon than anything else, and I think it's partially because people have, well, this affinity. I mean, salmon are such cool fish in the wild, and a lot of people that have this problem have this whole cultural, historical relationship with this fish in the wild and everything, and they just can't quite get there on the farm salmon. And so salmon has been picked up, and I know in Chile has been picked up a lot by the NGO community that then have followed it around and really highlighted a lot of the individual problems that have occurred. And of course then you had the crash, which didn't help the cause because the management was not so great as they intensified really rapidly, right? And so in a lot of other countries that are starting with other species and stuff, it hasn't been nearly as polarized. I would say that the other one that I've worked on in different earlier period was shrimp, and when there have been big disease problems where a virus has spread through the whole area and then essentially, just wiped out the area and the industry just moved to the next place or whatever, kind of slash and burn of disease. That didn't get great press. But where you get, these different tilapia, all these other systems that I've seen in Asia, it doesn't get much pushback at all. It's an employment source, it's a protein source, it's, income source and all this kind of stuff. So I've seen it really well received in a lot of countries. And this mussel, the mussels kind of came in after the salmon. It's probably a better, more well accepted. And yeah, part of it on salmon too is sort of an industry concentration that people get very suspect of a very concentrated industry in some of these. And that's not representative of aquaculture as a whole, really, in a lot of countries. So.
I think there's also too that those companies aren't necessarily Chilean in their origin. They're coming from somewhere else, Denmark and Norway, setting up companies and then taking the product out. So there can be a backlash to that.
There's even the myth that the Lisa virus was introduced by the
Norwegians. I heard that too, yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk and the aquaculture series. My name is Salvador, and I was wondering that one of the reasons that, one of the discourses that some governments or agency have is that aquaculture may help to offer like new jobs in the areas. But I hear you about like this process in China, like that the technology is developing, and there's a lot of, I think, mechanization ongoing in the aquaculture. And I'm not sure if those kind of processes will like revert this suggestion or this discourse of the agencies to create more jobs. So it will create the opposite, like just another industry.
Yeah, well, Chiloé, they really created a lot of jobs in Chiloé, but most of the job growth was not out on the farms. It was in the processing industry. Right? And then the big controversy was around the worker conditions and in the processing factories and stuff like that. But the overall income growth was quite large, and it really changed, transitioned that Chiloé economy for better or for worse from what it had been to what it became, right? And Steve and I share a friend, his son-in-law and my former graduate student that worked on this for quite a long time. And in general, the processing industry does obviously have a lot of jobs, not necessarily like the job we all want to go do for the rest of our life, but if you don't have a job, I mean, it can be a year-round continuous thing. So it does create jobs. I mean, there's no question about that, I think. And it's not so, it does get more, obviously, refined so that it requires less labor to sort everything, but it's still, I think, a fairly capital-intensive on the processing side. I mean, labor-intensive, sorry, on the processing side.
Okay, well, I think with that, we are about out of time here. So I think we just want to really thank Roz again, coming all the way down here, and the rest of our panelists.